The Arizona Territory, 1885. An unforgiving sun beats down on the vast expanse of desert, where nothing moves except heat waves shimmering across the barren landscape. The silence is absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant hawk. Circling above Dot into this desolation rides Miles Blackwood, a solitary figure on horseback. His weathered face is partially hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who has learned the hard way to trust nothing and no one. At 35, Miles has the look of someone who has seen too much of life's cruelty, each line in his face etched by experience rather than age. As he crests a rocky ridge, something catches his attention, an unnatural shape against the endless sand and scrub. Miles reins in his horse, narrowing his eyes against the glare. The shape doesn't move, but it doesn't belong in this desolate place. Drawing his rifle, Miles approaches cautiously. What appeared at first to be discarded clothing reveals itself to be a woman, crumpled on the baked earth. Her once fine dress is torn and bloodied, her skin blistered from the sun. Miles dismounts, kneeling beside her still form. By all rights, she should be dead, but as he gently turns her over, he detects the faintest rise and fall of her chest. The woman's face, though bruised and sun-damaged, bears the unmistakable marks of deliberate violence. This was no accident. Someone wanted her dead, and they nearly succeeded. Without hesitation, Miles lifts her carefully onto his horse. She weighs almost nothing in his arms, her body limp as a rag doll. Mounting behind her, he supports her unconscious form against his chest and turns his horse toward home. Aware that he's just made a decision that will change everything, Miles Ranch sits in splendid isolation among the foothills, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral nearby. As he approaches, an elderly Mexican man emerges from the barn. Pablo, Miles' only employee, and one of the few people he trusts. Pablo's eyes widen at the sight of the unconscious woman. Madre de Dios, what happened? Found her in the desert. Miles replies, his voice rough from disuse. Barely alive. Together, they bring her inside, where Pablo's wife Maria quickly takes charge, shooing the men from the bedroom as she tends to the stranger. Hours later, Maria emerges, her face grave. She lives, but only just. The fever is high. Someone beat her badly before leaving her to die. Will she make it? Miles asks. Maria crosses herself. With God's grace. But even if her body heals, who knows about her mind after such suffering? For 3 days, the woman hovers between life and death. Miles, though he tries to maintain his distance, finds himself drawn repeatedly to her bedside. There's something about her that stirs memories he'd rather keep buried, a vulnerability that calls to his long-suppressed protective instincts. On the 4th day, her fever breaks. As evening falls, Miles sits in the darkened room, watching over her. When her eyes finally flutter open, a startling green against her pale skin, he finds himself momentarily speechless. Fear flashes across her face as she takes in her unfamiliar surroundings and the stranger at her bedside. She tries to sit up, only to fall back with a gasp of pain. Don't try to move, Miles says quietly. You're safe here. Where am I? Her voice is barely a whisper, her throat raw from days without water. My ranch, about 20 miles from the nearest town. Miles offers her a cup of water, supporting her head as she drinks. Found you in the desert 4 days ago. The woman's brow furrows with confusion. The desert? She shakes her head weakly. I don't remember. That's your name. Miles asks. Panic rises in her eyes as she searches her memory and finds nothing. I don't know. Why can't I remember? Head wound, Miles explains, gesturing to the bandage at her temple. Memory might come back when you heal. And if it doesn't? Fear makes her voice tremble. Miles meets her gaze steadily. Then you start fresh. In the days that follow, the woman whom they begin to call Grace, for the grace of God that kept her alive, gradually regains her physical strength. Though her memory remains elusive, her determination grows. She insists on helping around the ranch, despite Maria's protests that she should rest. Miles observes her from a distance, impressed by her resilience, but wary of becoming too involved. Something about Grace's situation feels dangerous, and danger is something Miles has carefully avoided for years. One evening, as Grace sits on the porch watching the sunset, Miles joins her, offering a cup of coffee. They sit in companionable silence until Grace speaks. "You don't talk much about yourself." Miles takes a sip of his coffee. "Not much to tell." "I find that hard to believe," Grace counters. A man living alone miles from anywhere, who saves strangers from the desert without asking questions. There's a story there. The ghost of a smile touches Miles' lips. "Could say the same about you. Woman in a fine dress found half dead in the desert?" Grace's expression clouds. "At least you know your story. Mine is ... She gestures helplessly. "Gone." "Maybe that's a blessing," Miles suggests. "Some things are better forgotten." "Is that why you're out here? To forget?" The question hits too. Close to home, Miles rises abruptly. "Should check the horses before dark." As he walks away, Grace calls after him. "Thank you for saving me, for everything." Miles pauses, nods once without turning, then continues to the barn. Grace watches him go, sensing the weight of secrets he carries. Despite his reticence, she feels safe with Miles in a way she can't explain, as if some part of her recognizes a kindred spirit in this solitary man. That night, Grace dreams, vivid, terrifying fragments that fade upon waking, leaving only impressions of fear and betrayal. She wakes gasping for breath, her heart pounding. Finding sleep impossible, she wanders to the kitchen for water. Through the window, she spots Miles sitting on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, scanning the darkness. Not just habit, she realizes, but vigilance. He's watching for something, or someone. The knowledge should frighten her, but instead, it brings a strange comfort. Whatever dangers might be out there, Miles Blackwood stands between them and her. For now, that will have to be enough. Erim BNC 2 weeks pass. Grace's physical wounds heal, though her memory remains fragmented. Occasional flashes come to her, the sound of crystal glasses clinking, the feel of silk against her skin, a man's voice raised in anger, but nothing concrete enough to build an identity around. Despite Miles' continued reserve, a tentative friendship forms between them. He teaches her to ride, surprised by how quickly she takes to it. Muscle memory, he explains, suggesting she'd ridden before. These small revelations about herself become treasures to Grace, pieces of a puzzle she desperately wants to complete. One morning, Miles announces he needs to ride into town for supplies. Grace, eager to escape the confines of the ranch, begs to accompany him. "Too risky," Miles says flatly. "Better if folks don't know you're here." "Why?" Grace challenges. "Are you expecting trouble?" Miles' expression darkens. "Always expect trouble. Lived longer that way." But Grace persists, and eventually Miles relents, though he insists she wears simple clothing that won't draw attention. As they ride toward the small town of Redemption, Grace senses Miles growing increasingly tense. "Is there something you're not telling me?" she asks. Miles hesitates before answering. Town can be dangerous for strangers. Keep close, don't talk to anyone, and if there's trouble, you ride straight back to the ranch. Understand? Grace nods, both intrigued and unsettled by his warning. Redemption proves to be a typical frontier town. Dusty Main Street lined with wooden buildings, a saloon, general store, and small sheriff's office. As they hitch their horses outside the store, Grace notices how Miles positions himself to keep the entire street in view. Inside, the storekeeper greets Miles with cautious respect. "Blackwood, been a while." Miles nods tersely, handing over a list of supplies. As the storekeeper fills the order, Grace wanders the small shop, drawn to a display of fine perfumes. She picks up a crystal bottle, and suddenly flash, an elegant dressing table covered with similar bottles. A maid helping her fasten a necklace. "You look beautiful, Miss Elizabeth." The bottle slips from Grace's fingers, shattering on the floor. "Elizabeth," she whispers. "My name is Elizabeth." Miles is at her side instantly, concern in his eyes. "What is it? I remembered something." "My name. I think it's Elizabeth." Before Miles can respond, the door opens, and 3 men enter the store. Their appearance is unremarkable, but Miles' reaction is immediate and alarming. He positions himself in front of Grace, his hand moving to rest near his holstered revolver. The leader of the group, a hawk-faced man with cold eyes, notices them and smiles unpleasantly. "Well now, if it isn't the mysterious Mr. Blackwood. Rarely grace us with your presence these days." His gaze shifts to Grace, and something in his expression makes her blood run cold. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "Just passing through," Miles says, his voice deceptively casual. "Visiting her cousin in Tucson. That so?" The man looks skeptical. "Funny time of year for traveling, especially for a lady." Grace can feel the tension radiating from Miles, sees how the other men have spread out in the store, blocking potential exits. "Our business is our own, Mr. Reed," Miles says quietly. The name strikes Grace like a physical blow. Reed. Something about it triggers a cascade of panic within her, though she can't place why. Reed smiles, showing too many teeth. Of course. Just being neighborly." He tips his hat to Grace. "Ma'am, hope you enjoy your stay in our little town." As Reed and his men leave, Grace realizes she's trembling. Miles quickly pays for their supplies, adding several boxes of ammunition to their order. They ride out of town in silence, pushing a faster pace than their arrival. Only when redemption is far behind them does Miles slow their horses. "Who was that man?" Grace asks. "Reed. I recognized his name, though I don't know how." Miles studies her face carefully. "Jackson Reed. Works for a man named Victor Harrington. Biggest rancher in the territory. Not someone you want to notice you." "He frightened me," Grace admits. "Not just because of his manner. Something deeper. The mind remembers even when you don't," Miles says. "If Reed scares you, there's likely good reason." That night, Grace's dreams are more vivid than ever. She sees herself in a grand house, wearing a silk gown. There's an older man with a distinguished beard, calling her "my dear." Then the scene shifts, and she's in a darkened office, opening a safe hidden behind a painting, papers in her hands. A door opening, Reed's face contorted with rage. Running, falling, pain. She wakes screaming. Miles bursts into her room, revolver in hand, ready to confront whatever danger threatened her. When he realizes it was just a nightmare, he lowers the gun but remains in the doorway, his expression concerned. "I remembered," Grace gasps. "Not everything, but enough. I took documents from a safe. Reed caught me. He works for a man named Harrington, just like you said." "What documents?" Miles asks. Grace shakes her head in frustration. "I don't know, but they were important enough that they tried to kill me for them." Miles is silent for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Finally, he says, "Get dressed. There's something you need to see." Grace follows Miles to the barn, where he unlocks a small trunk hidden beneath the floorboards. From it, he withdraws a folded newspaper clipping and hands it to her. The headline reads, Harrington heiress missing, feared dead. Below is a photograph of a young woman with Grace's face, identified as Elizabeth Harrington, daughter of railroad. Tycoon Victor Harrington. That's me? Grace whispers, stunned. I'm his daughter? Appears so, Miles confirms. Article's 3 weeks old. Says you disappeared from your father's estate. Mentions a substantial reward for information. Grace stares at the photograph, trying to reconcile the elegant woman pictured with her fragmented memories. If I'm his daughter, why would I steal from him? Why would Reed try to kill me? That, Miles says grimly, is what we need to figure out. In the days that follow, more memories return to Grace, or Elizabeth, as she now thinks of herself. She recalls growing up in luxury, her mother's death when she was a teenager, her increasingly strained relationship with her father as she grew older. Most importantly, she remembers discovering something terrible. Her father's business dealings weren't merely ruthless, but criminal. The documents she took were proof of fraud, bribery, and possibly murder. He's not just a railroad tycoon, she explains to Miles as they sit by the fire one evening. He's been forcing smaller ranchers off their land for the railroad, bribing officials, even arranging accidents for those who won't sell. And Reed is his enforcer, Miles concludes. Elizabeth nods. When I confronted my father, he acted concerned, promised to make things right. But later that night, I overheard him telling Reed to handle the situation. That's when I took the documents and ran. Miles' expression darkens. And they caught up with you in the desert. They took the documents, beat me, and left me to die. Elizabeth shivers despite the fire's warmth. But why didn't they make sure I was dead? Arrogance, Miles suggests. Desert usually finishes what men start. Elizabeth studies Miles' face in the firelight. Throughout her revelations, he's remained calm, as if nothing she's told him comes as a surprise. You knew, she realizes suddenly. When you found me, you knew who I was. Miles meets her gaze steadily. Suspected. Didn't know for certain until town. Why didn't you tell me? Wasn't my place. Memory's tricky. Better if it returns naturally. Elizabeth feels a flash of anger at his withholding, but it quickly fades. Miles has protected her, given her time to heal and remember on her own terms. Still, she senses he's holding something back. There's more, isn't there? Something you're not telling me. Miles is silent for so long that Elizabeth thinks he won't answer. When he finally speaks, his voice is low, weighted with memories. 5 years ago, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal, investigating claims against your father, similar to what you discovered. Land fraud, mostly. Had a witness willing to testify. Elizabeth's eyes widen at this revelation. What happened? Night before the trial, someone killed my witness. Made it look like a robbery. I kept digging, got too close to the truth. There was an ambush. Miles' hand unconsciously moves to his side, where Elizabeth knows a significant scar lies beneath. His shirt. When I recovered, I found myself accused of taking bribes, evidence tampering. My word against theirs. My father's doing, Elizabeth whispers, the pieces falling into place. Miles nods once. Had to disappear? Start over. So when you found me, you recognized the Harrington connection. Elizabeth feels a chill. Why help me? I'm a Harrington, daughter of the man who destroyed your life. You're not your father, Miles says simply. An enemy of my enemy. Their conversation is interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Miles is instantly alert, moving to the window, rifle in hand. Reed, he says grimly, and at least 6 others. Elizabeth's heart races. How did they find me? Doesn't matter now. Take the back trail to the cave we scouted. I'll hold them here, then follow. I won't leave you to face them alone. Miles turns to her, and for the first time, She sees naked emotion in his eyes, concern, determination, and something else she can't name. "Trust me," he says quietly. "Please." The plea from this man of few words convinces her. Elizabeth nods, then impulsively steps forward and kisses his cheek. "Be careful." As she slips out the back door, she hears Reed's voice calling from the front of the cabin. "Blackwood, we know she's there. Send out the Harrington woman, and maybe you'll live through the night." Elizabeth hesitates, torn between escape and concern for Miles. Then a rifle shot cracks the night, and the decision is made. She runs for the horses, praying Miles will follow, as promised. Dawn breaks over the mountains. As Elizabeth waits anxiously in the cave, hideout she and Miles had prepared days earlier. After hours of silence, she finally hears the approach of a horse. She readies the revolver Miles taught her to use, peering cautiously from the cave entrance. Relief floods her as she recognizes Miles, though her joy quickly turns to concern. He dismounts stiffly, favoring his left side where a dark stain spreads across his shirt. "You're hurt," she exclaims, helping him into the cave. "Just a graze," Miles dismisses, though his pallor suggests otherwise. Reed's men aren't the best. Shots. As Elizabeth helps clean and bandage his wound, she asks the question that's been tormenting her. "What happened back there?" "Reed wanted you alive," Miles explains, wincing as she tightens the bandage. "Said your father's offering $5,000 for your return. When I refused to give you up, they tried to rush the cabin. I convinced them that was a bad idea." Elizabeth's hands still. "You killed them?" "Two," Miles admits without remorse. "Rest scattered after that, but they'll be back." Reed doesn't give up easy, especially with that kind of money at stake. "What do we do now?" Miles meets her gaze. "You tell me. Your father thinks you're dead. Could start fresh somewhere else. New name, new life." Elizabeth considers this. Aye. Clean break, leaving behind the Harrington name and all its dark legacy. Part of her yearns for that simplicity. But another part, the part that risked everything to steal those documents, rejects the easy path. "No," she says firmly. "My father needs to answer for his crimes. The documents I took, people were hurt because of what they revealed. I can't just walk away." Miles studies her face, and she sees something like pride in his eyes. "Documents are gone," he reminds her gently. "Your word against his won't be enough." "Then we'll find more evidence," Elizabeth insists. "You were investigating him before. You must know something that could help." A slow smile spreads across Miles' face, the first genuine smile she's seen from him. "As it happens, I kept copies of everything, hidden where even Reed couldn't find them. For the next 2 days, they remain in the cave, recovering and planning." Miles reveals that he has maintained a network of contacts over the years, people who had also suffered at Harrington's. Hands. Through them, he's continued gathering evidence against the tycoon, waiting for the right moment to act. "Why haven't you used it before now?" Elizabeth asks. "Needed someone with credibility to bring the charges," Miles explains. "Ex-marshal with a bounty on his head wouldn't get far. But the daughter of Victor Harrington might," Elizabeth concludes. There. Plan takes shape. They will travel to the territorial capital, where a federal judge known for his incorruptibility holds court. Elizabeth will present herself and the evidence, testifying against her father. But first, they need to retrieve Miles' hidden documents from another location, a dangerous journey that will take them dangerously close to Harrington territory. As they prepare to leave their hideout, Elizabeth notices a change in Miles. The reserved, cautious man who rescued her has been replaced by someone more determined, more alive. His eyes hold a purpose that wasn't there before. "Why now?" she asks him. "After 5 years of hiding, why?" "Risk everything?" Miles secures the last of their supplies before answering. Some things are worth the risk. His eyes meet hers, and Elizabeth understands he's not just talking about justice against her father. Something has grown between them during these weeks of danger and revelation, a bond forged in shared purpose and mutual respect that might, given time, become something more. They travel by night, avoiding main trails. During a brief rest, Miles suddenly stiffens, signaling for silence. Elizabeth hears it too. Horses approaching, moving fast. Down! Miles whispers urgently, pulling her into a ravine seconds before riders appear on the ridge above. From their hiding place, they watch as Reed and 4 men pass. They're heading toward the cave hideout, following a trail that Miles deliberately left to mislead them. That won't fool them for long, Elizabeth says when the riders are gone. Long enough, Miles assures her. We'll reach Johnson's Crossing by dawn. Documents are hidden there. Johnson's Crossing proves to be little more than a handful of buildings clustered around a river ford, a way station for travelers heading north. Miles leads Elizabeth to a boarded-up trading post on the settlement's edge. Inside, dust covers everything, the air stale from years of abandonment. Miles moves confidently to the back room, prying up floorboards to reveal a metal strongbox. Sam Johnson was a friend, Miles explains as he works the combination. Let me hide this here before he moved on. The box contains carefully preserved documents, land deeds with forged signatures, financial records showing suspicious payments to officials, witness statements about accidents that befell those who opposed Harrington's expansion. Most damning are letters in Harrington's own hand, instructing Reed on how to handle various problems. This is more than enough, Elizabeth says, examining the evidence. Combined with my testimony, it could destroy him. Miles nods, relief evident in his expression. 5 years of waiting, of careful planning, might finally bear fruit. Their moment of triumph is short-lived. The sound of approaching horses shatters the quiet, and Miles rushes to the window. Reed, he says grimly, must have figured out our diversion. Elizabeth quickly gathers the documents. Is there another way out? Back door leads to the river. Horses are behind the building. They're halfway to the door when it bursts open, revealing Reed and 2 of his men, guns drawn. Well, Reed smirks. The prodigal daughter and the disgraced marshal. Your father will be pleased to see you, Miss Harrington, though I can't say the same for your companion. My father will hang when these documents reach the federal judge. Elizabeth retorts, clutching the evidence to her chest. Reed laughs. Those papers aren't going anywhere, and neither are you, except back to your father. He gestures to his men. Take her. Kill him. What happens next unfolds in seconds. Miles draws and fires in one fluid motion, dropping one of Reed's men before diving for cover. Elizabeth scrambles behind a counter as bullets splinter the wood around her. Reed advances on Miles' position, firing methodically, forcing him back. Elizabeth spots a lantern hanging nearby. In a desperate move, she throws it at Reed. Oil splashes across the floor, igniting instantly from a fallen lamp. Fire races across the dry wooden boards, creating a barrier between them and their attackers. Go! Miles shouts to Elizabeth, covering her retreat as she dashes for the back door. Outside, they mount their horses and race toward the river. Reed and his remaining men follow, gaining ground rapidly. As they reach the ford, Miles' horse stumbles on the slippery riverbed, throwing him into the swift current. Elizabeth watches in horror as he disappears beneath the surface. Without hesitation, she plunges her horse into the river, scanning desperately for any sign of him. Long seconds pass before she spots him downstream, clinging to a partially submerged tree. Reed reaches the riverbank, taking careful aim at Miles' exposed position. Elizabeth makes a split-second decision. Turning her horse toward Reed, she charges directly at him, screaming a war cry that startles both men. Reed's shot goes wide, and before he can recover, Elizabeth is upon him in the knee. Chaotic struggle that follows. Reed's gun discharges, striking his own companion. Elizabeth is thrown from her horse, landing hard on the rocky shore. Reed advances on her, drawing a knife. "Your father wanted you alive," he snarls. "But accidents happen." Before he can strike, a shot rings out. Reed freezes, a look of disbelief crossing his face before he crumples to the ground. Behind him stands Miles, dripping wet and unsteady, his revolver still aimed at where Reed had stood. Elizabeth rushes to Miles, supporting him as his strength wavers. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispers. "Takes more than a river to stop me." He replies, though his voice is weak. Together, they recover the scattered documents, miraculously mostly dry, inside Elizabeth's waterproof saddlebags. Though injured and exhausted, they press on, knowing that Reed's death will only accelerate Harrington's attempts to find them. 3 days later, they arrive at the territorial capital. The journey has taken its toll on both of them, but particularly on Miles, whose wound has reopened during their flight. Despite Elizabeth's pleas that he see a doctor, he insists on accompanying her to the federal courthouse. Judge William Daniels receives them in his chambers, his stern expression softening, as Elizabeth presents their evidence and tells her story. As Miles adds his testimony about the earlier investigation and subsequent frame-up, the judge's face grows increasingly grave. "These accusations are extremely serious," Judge Daniels says when they finish. "Victor Harrington is one of the most powerful men in the territory, and one of the most corrupt," Elizabeth counters. "I'm his daughter. I've seen his operations from the inside. Everything in those documents is true." The judge studies her for a long moment, then nods. "I'll issue warrants immediately. Federal marshals will bring him in." He turns to Miles. "As for you, Mr. Blackwood, or should I say Marshal Cole, these documents clearly support your claim of being framed. I'll see that your name is cleared." As they leave the courthouse, the enormity of what they've accomplished begins to sink in. Years of Harrington's corruption will be exposed. Justice so long delayed is finally within reach. "What will you do now?" Elizabeth asks as they walk slowly toward their hotel. "Return to the marshals?" Miles shakes his head. "That life's behind." Might go back to the ranch, rebuild what Reed's men destroyed." He glances at her. "What about you?" "Harrington fortune will likely be yours once the dust settles." Elizabeth hasn't considered this. The wealth, the position, the power that will come with her father's downfall, all hers by right of birth. "I don't want his money," she says firmly. "Too much pain attached to it." "I thought maybe ... double quotes." She hesitates, suddenly uncertain. "I thought maybe I could help with that rebuilding, if you wanted." Miles stops walking, turning to face her. In his eyes, Elizabeth sees the answer before he speaks. "Been alone a long time," he says quietly. "Wouldn't mind some company." A hint of a smile touches his lips. "Especially yours." 2 weeks later, the newspapers trumpet Victor Harrington's arrest and the shocking exposure of his criminal empire. The story captivates the territory. The corrupt tycoon brought down by his own daughter and a wrongfully accused lawman. But by then, Elizabeth and Miles are far from the public eye, traveling back toward the desert that nearly claimed her life. The journey is slower this time, peaceful rather than desperate. They stop frequently, Miles pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the land they passed through. When they finally reach the burned-out remains of Miles' ranch, Elizabeth feels a momentary doubt. The destruction is complete. Cabin, barn, corral, all reduced to charred timbers and ash. "We can rebuild it," she says, trying to sound confident. Make it better than before. Miles surveys the devastation, but his expression holds no regret. Already started, he says, nodding toward a cleared area where foundation stones have been laid for a new structure. Pablo and Maria emerge from a temporary shelter, waving in welcome. They came back after Reed's men left, Miles explains. Said, they were waiting for us. For us, Elizabeth repeats, savoring the word in all it implies. As the sun sets behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Miles takes Elizabeth's hand in his. No words are needed between them now. They have fought their way through betrayal and violence, secrets and lies, to reach this moment of possibility, the desert that nearly became. Elizabeth's grave has instead become the birthplace of her new life, one built on truth, trust, and the love of a man who found her when she was lost, and in doing so, found himself again. Together, they will build something stronger than either could have imagined alone, their shared pain transformed into shared purpose. In the fading light, Miles pulls Elizabeth close, and she rests her head against his shoulder, finally at peace. The silence between them is no longer filled with secrets, but with promise. The promise of redemption, of healing, of home. Asterisk.